The chandeliers pooled molten light over the private dining room, perfume and expensive tobacco braided into the air, and the piano at the corner kept time with a patient, metallic tick. Maya Bennett, 27, adjusted the crease of her navy waistcoat for the third time that night, fingers remembering the cadence of a life she preferred to keep invisible. She worked the front desk at the club because the pay kept her mother safe, and because anonymity had been a shelter. What she carried beneath the sleeve of her reserve was a quiet training no one here suspected, and a memory she never spoke aloud. Marco Rinaldi entered like a sentence that did not allow interruption. Suit pressed, shoes that made the marble remember every step, an aura that asked for deference. He moved with a kind of practiced command that left small tremors in the room. When his mother, Marta Alvarez, reached out with a palm as if to smooth the air between them, Maya saw the gesture and answered in soft, practiced motions that were almost invisible to everyone else. That small exchange loosened something in the room and made some people glance a degree too long. Marco watched. He was curiosity masquerading as indifference. What Maya did not know then was that a single act of attention would tilt the balance between power and mercy and make her the only person who could cross a fault line that many pretended not to see. They did not know the night would demand a choice. The first rupture came with conversation and small, dangerous measurements. "Do you always seat my table here?" asked Marco, his voice a flat surface over heat. "Only on Thursdays when the director dines with guests," replied Janine Porter, the manager, tone measured, eyes on the ledger. "Your mother asked for a change," said Marco, and he looked at Maya as if he were testing the grain of wood beneath a varnish. "She has a favorite corner," said Maya, soft, holding a tray more steady than she felt. "You seem familiar with her," said Marco, and the question had the shape of an order. "She knows me from the charity evenings," answered Maya. "You know more than that," he said, smile narrowed. "Do you know how to speak with people who do not use words?" he asked again, curiosity edged with calculation. The room collected the syllables like water in a bowl. Janine watched the exchange with the thin patience of someone who weighed risks by the hour. "Maya," she said finally, "make sure everything is as requested." Small choices closed and opened doors that were not labeled. A polite nod could be a contract. A gentle sign could be a claim. What turned routine into rupture was not the patrons or the menu, but what happened after the coffee arrived. Marco rose slowly, a hand at his chest, an expression that slid from control to raw alarm. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He fled language. His breaths came quick and shallow, as if someone had tightened a rope around the room and pulled. Glasses chimed, conversations dimmed, and the air moved like a held breath. Marta stood frozen, with a napkin crumbled in her hand. The staff hesitated, with training on their tongues and rules on their sleeves. Maya saw the pale lock at the root of his neck, the clammy sheen at his temple, and she moved before a committee of procedure could assemble. She knelt, used fingertips to check pulse, felt it racing like an animal trapped in a small room, and spoke in a voice meant to study. "Sir, listen to me. Slow your breathing with me," she said. "In through the nose, out through the mouth," she coached calmly. One by one, heads turned with suspicion, then relief. "What is it?" asked Vittorio Lombardi, his consigliere, voice flat and small with worry. "He is having a panic attack," Maya said plainly. "Give him space and water," she added, while Janine fetched a glass. Marco's eyes focused on her, as if surprised that someone had dismantled his panic and left intact the frame of his dignity. The room, which had been a taut instrument of appearance, softened at that small repair. She had no intention of revealing the precise roots of the past that taught her to move fast and quiet. Yet, the emergency made secrets speak. Years before, Maya had learned first aid from a volunteer course that began as a way to earn community service hours and grew into something like devotion. She had been 19 then, balancing shifts and classes and a mother who worked nights. and she fell into the rhythm of responding to small crises in shelters and on busier blocks of the city. It was not bravery at first, but a method of survival. She had given mouth to mouth to an old man who had lost track of time, had wrapped a child's head with a trembling bandage when a bicycle met a curb, had learned how to read a pulse like a short line of Morse code. Those years taught her three truths. People revealed themselves in breath, hands could lie, but pulses rarely did, and the smallest humane act formed a ledger that no money could erase. She did not speak about those nights because names stuck and danger traveled quickly through tongues. The training had roots in a quieter life, in which loyalty meant keeping a mother from being noticed by creditors who liked to speak loudly, and by a history that might prefer debts repaid with shame. That old life preferred that she remain invisible, but invisibility is a fragile garment in a room full of mirrors and expensive chairs. The memory of a hand she once studied shaped the decision she made in the dining room. It was not courage of legend, it was the mundane courage of someone who had done small rescues until small rescues became the only language she trusted. If this moment in the story touched you, pause now and think about what you would do in Maya's shoes. Right now, the protagonist faces a choice that will change everything for people she loves and for strangers bound to power. If you were there, would you step forward and risk being noticed to save a life, or would you step back and keep quiet to keep your own safety? Tell me in the comments which value would weigh more for you: lealtad, security, freedom, or something else. Your answer makes this community richer, and the best comments will be featured in future episodes because your experiences help others see choices from angles they did not expect. I read the comments and I value them because they shape how we tell these stories. Now, back to Maya and Marco and the thin line between help and exposure. There were immediate consequences that rippled like stones dropped into polite water. Vittorio watched Maya with a new arithmetic. Luca Ferrer, a runner who smelled faintly of petrol and old arguments, took a chair and sat so close that the seams of his jacket protested. Detective Aaron Cruz, who happened to be at another table on a private visit and who recognized Marco from files, did not intervene. He kept his badge in a pocket like a sleeping animal. "You fixed him," said Marco, later in a quieter corridor where the light pooled in small rectangles. "You watched him break," he added, with a voice that wanted to be a ledger. "Why did you help?" he asked. Maya said only what was true. "I did not want him to be alone in that," she said. "Alone then," he corrected. "Alone now could cost you." "I know what alone costs," she answered. The conversation was an exchange of weights. Janine, tending to her managerial code, tried to shield Maya from formal connection to the Rinaldi table by organizing an invoice and a bow that looked like distance. For Marco, the incident was a crack in routine, a proof that the walls around his life could be touched by the ordinary, and he began to watch who moved in the periphery. The first true tension arrived when Marco asked for Maya to accompany his mother to a private parlor for tea the next evening. The request had the shape of an order, because power often wore that shape. "I prefer someone discreet," he said. "Discretion is what I do," Maya replied, voice steady, though her chest carried a private tightness. Marta needed help walking. She needed the kindness that came without performance. The parlor smelled of lemon oil and expensive regret. Vittorio lingered in the doorway like a second shadow. Luca hovered outside the door with the air of a man whose job is to measure exits. The meeting began with polite talk, then drifted into shapes made of trust and calculation. Slowly, evidence of a different sort surfaced. A waiter left a tray and accidentally left a linen envelope tucked under the sugar bowl. Maya's eyes caught the outline of a document stamped with a logo she had once seen in court exhibits. The envelope was a riddle. She slid a hand so that a corner of paper could be glimpsed and saw numbers that matched accounts she had overheard whispered at the shelter where Rosa, her mother, volunteered. She recognized family names like scars on old maps. That was the moment she realized the stakes were not abstract. The ledger on that paper could redraw territories and cut off pensions and exile children from safety. She had to decide whether to protect a woman who asked for her help or to preserve her family from a danger that came with curiosity. The choice moved from moral to logistical when the men who collected debts began to notice the misplacement of funds and the trail that led, absurdly, through a charity account. A surveillance detail arrived at the club disguised as suppliers. The first full moment of paranoia had a sound like a phone on low volume at the bottom of a drawer. It is a small sound that translates into hours of sleepless watch. Maya noticed a car that waited too long beneath the service entrance. She noticed a man who did not belong to the guests sitting with his head bowed, reading an old newspaper with eyes that did not read. That silence became a pressure. The danger was not loud. It was a patient narrowing. "We cannot let them find that envelope," Vittorio said to Marco in a low voice one night. "Then remove it," Marco answered with a fatigue edged by fear. Maya knew where the envelope had been placed and what information it carried that could dismantle safe houses and point to people who had nothing to do with ledgers, but everything to do with survival. The decision to move the document was a crossing. "If you take it, you may be betraying someone," she told Marco. "If you leave it, you may be betraying many," he said. The two lines intersected at the point where trust became currency. They planned a way to extract the envelope and place it where it could not be weaponized, but where it could serve as evidence to stop a cycle. The plan was simple in speech and complicated in practice. Janine provided a maintenance schedule to cover a gap. Detective Aaron offered to hold a channel open in case a search was triggered. Dr. Simon Hale agreed to examine any medical signatures if needed. The extraction required timing and a quiet technical procedure to copy data securely. In a small technical paragraph that later saved every life nearby, an expert described how to clone a flash drive without altering file metadata by using a write blocker device and a separate imaging tool that created a forensic copy bit by bit. The copy was encrypted and stored on a courier phone with a secure envelope app until attorneys could verify chain of custody. The process was clinical and cold and precise, and the knowledge of it calmed the chaos into a task. The warehouse confrontation was the place where all threads braided and snapped. It began with a false calm. Marco had proposed a transfer to a storage facility he claimed was for seasonal inventory. The lights there were sparse and the air tasted of oil and cold metal. Vittorio, Luca, two plainclothesmen, and Marco met under a skylight that remembered rain. Maya arrived because she had been asked to hand over a small item to Marta for safekeeping. The item turned into the envelope, and the envelope turned into proof. Voices rose like water. "We cannot have this out," Vittorio said. "This is family," Marco answered. "Family does not trade in silence when people are harmed," Maya said, and her voice was a small, bright thing in a large, empty room. An argument became a shove became a spilled crate, and crates became the sound of decisions landing like stones. A man lunged for the envelope, and a moment of instinct became a decision point. Maya pushed past a falling stack, grabbed the envelope, and ran. She could feel breath in her neck and shoes scraping against concrete. For 3 minutes time measured itself by a different mathematics: the number of steps taken before a door closed, the way a hand found a knob, the exact tilt of her shoulders. She ducked into a shadowed stairwell and heard men curse the echo. The chase was a physical moment of tension that lasted long enough to bruise memory. The warehouse seemed to hold its breath and wait to see who would move next. A second moment of terror arrived when Detective Aaron Cruz, who had been watching from a corner as an official, for reasons that would later be explained, produced a badge and a small bolt of authority. "Everyone down," he ordered quietly, and old loyalties reeled under the weight of law. Vittorio considered his options like a man counting coins. Luca looked at Marco with a face that asked whether loyalty was a shelter or a sentence. The situation spun into negotiations, with evidence laid like cards on a table. "We can make this go away," Vittorio whispered. "Make it mean something else," Marco almost smiled, but did not. Maya watched, hand on the envelope, her pulse a steady drum. No more invisibility, she thought, no more debts paid in silence. The moment where law touched family was complicated. It was not clean. Deals were offered in muffled tones. Promises were made that smelled of compromise. In the end, Marco chose to hand the envelope to Detective Aaron under a protection plan that required names to be redacted and funds to be frozen. For Marco, it was a wager and also a surrender. For Maya, it was the resolution of an impossible ledger. The immediate consequences rearranged daily things. Janine informed staff that schedules would change for security. Rosa Bennett, Maya's mother, found new quiet payments that lifted the immediate pressure she lived under. Vittorio left the club for a temporary exile that smelled like burned paper and folded money. Luca was reassigned to a different territory. Marta was given medical attention and a discreet driver. Marco entered a period of treatment that was as much about learning to breathe as it was about protecting a reputation. He surprised people by agreeing to counseling and to a public statement that reframed fault in neutral tones, while the city's legal channels dug into accounts. Families were shaken loose from timetables of fear and began to reframe what counted as safety. Maya returned to work with a new sobriety in her steps. She often paused at the front desk and noticed the ways the room now measured her differently. Some members whispered approval, others whispered suspicions. The debt she once carried toward invisibility now had an account that read kindness as credit. 1 month later, the superficial rhythms began returning, but with new stakes. A community fund had been quietly seeded with assets frozen from corrupt accounts and redirected to scholarships for children of displaced workers. Rosa Bennett used some of the official compensation to secure a small apartment where she no longer kept the curtains closed against collectors. Marta began to attend weekly therapy with Dr. Simon Hale, who taught her breathing exercises and a way to name panic before it swallowed memory. Janine reopened a program at the club to train staff in emergency response, and monthly meetings now included a liaison from the police department to keep channels clean. Marco attended his sessions and sometimes lingered at the edge of the club, watching the staff like someone examining a map. Detective Aaron still came by and occasionally met with Marco in rooms that smelled of citrus and coffee. 3 months later, a quieter transformation had settled. The community fund had sponsored vocational training that employed 5 people who had been in danger of deportation and 2 who had lost jobs during the investigations. Vittorio's exile turned into relocation that kept him distant but alive. Luca's reassignment became an apprenticeship under a tradesman who taught him to build rather than to collect. The envelope's contents had rippled into a legal case that led to testimony and to a conviction that changed the accounting at several shell companies. The club itself instituted anonymous reporting and a voluntarily transparency policy that surprised investors and calmed patrons. Maya enrolled in a continuing education class that deepened her emergency skills and allowed her to be on a roster as a certified responder. The city noticed the ripple, and a small civic group used the story to call for better protections for workers who existed at invisible crossings between worlds. 6 months after the night that moved everything, Saya's life had new coordinates. The scholarship program had a ceremony, and Rosa Bennett stood at a podium to speak about fear and the strange currencies of courage. Marco, still a presence in the margins, made a private donation under a pseudonym to fund mental health workshops at the community center, and he began to meet quietly with representatives interested in restructuring old networks. Detective Aaron published a report that credited anonymous witnesses and professionals who respected chains of custody. Marta led a small group of elder women who met weekly to practice breathing and to speak about dignity. Janine opened a hospitality training center that offered secure jobs to those who had been vulnerable. Dr. Simon Hale became a public advocate for early mental health interventions for people of influence. In the middle of all of this, Maya found that the ledger in her life had shifted. She had been rewarded with steady work, a scholarship slot she had used to finish a certificate, and a quiet reputation as someone who could both keep secrets and turn them into repair. The larger truth that had been hard to name was that kindness can break systems and build structures at once. She had ended up on a list of people credited for change, but the list felt inadequate because her actions had been small and stubborn and human. People came to rely on her not because she had been a heroine in an epic sense, but because she chose to be present when most preferred to pretend not to hear. The city did not become innocent overnight. Old loyalties did not vanish, and power remained a complicated currency. Yet the arc of that evening had seeded something that grew in unexpected ways. Families who had been at risk of exile were given alternatives. Workplaces developed safer channels for reporting. A man who had been used to barking orders now learned to recognize panic in a mirror and to ask for help. And Maya learned the cost and the gift of being visible. She was not celebrated on marquees, she was not immune to fear. She still paused sometimes when a car idled below the club or when an envelope arrived with extra stamps. But she also had a new clarity. Sometimes being brave was the smallest motion you could manage. Sometimes saving someone was not a headline, but a quiet ledger entry that allowed others to live. If this story moved you, write in the comments whether you would risk exposure to protect someone else and which value you would choose in that moment. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel for narratives that mix investigation and heart, and for a community that discusses what lealtad costs in the modern city. At the end, the life they were rebuilding proved a simple truth. Some legacies are inherited, and some are chosen. The last thing Maya learned was as modest as it was profound. Sometimes being brave means answering a human breath with another human breath.